Hi folks, this is Tierah Ruins Things with Science, a podcast about the science of immunology and infectious diseases in pop culture. I am Tierah, and I am here to ruin your favorite TV shows and movies by telling you how badly they butchered science. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2010 movie Black Death, starring Sean Bean, Eddie Redmayne, and Carice Van Houten, among a few others you might recognize. It's available to rent on, all the things, Apple TV and Amazon Prime. Before doing this episode, I hadn't actually seen Black Death, which is different from most of the episodes I've done or planned out already. There aren't too many movies featuring the plague, and I'd already seen Season of the Witch, but that didn't really have much to do with the disease of the plague, and it wasn't that great, so I didn't want to cover that one. I did want to do something on plague, though, because it was one of the most interesting diseases I studied in my undergrad, which was in immunology. I think in social studies classes in high school, I had always found it morbidly interesting thinking about the plague and what it would have been like to live before antibiotics, too. Even though I had studied this before, I did learn a lot about it as I researched, including the one thing that really makes the plague unique in its spread and probably explains why it was so successful and nearly wiped out all of Europe. Before I start, I want to put this out there for those of you who don't listen to credits at the end. If you have any movie or episode of a TV show that features an infectious disease that you want me to ruin with science, email me at tierahruinsthings@gmail.com or get in touch on social media and I'll look into it and maybe I'll do an episode on it. Just please, not CSI. It's too easy and there's just too much to ruin. The movie begins with an opening monologue that talks about the terrifying scale of just how far this disease reached and how many people it killed. The most current, extensively researched source puts the estimated death toll between 60 to 65% of the European population, so saying that it would leave half the kingdom dead, as they do in the monologue, is not wrong. It is really hard to get an accurate estimate of the death toll, though, since you need a lot of contemporary records from many different places for this. But the source I read, a book called A Complete History of the Black Death by Ulla Benedicto, he took into account 300 demographic studies from all over Europe in order to come to his estimate of 60 to 65%. In that book, the author does throw a little bit of shade at some of the other estimates as being based on bad math or on nothing at all. So if you see sources out there that say 30% died, 50% of people died, they're not wrong. It's just probably a drastic underestimate of the true scale of this disease's death toll. I've even seen those estimates in academic sources, uncited, as if it's common knowledge and doesn't need to be cited. Well, Mr. Benedicto painstakingly researched for decades the true death toll of the Black Death and put it all into the second edition of his book, which came out in 2021, so I think I'm just going to go with his educated guess. I can't say numbers for sure for the rest of the areas affected by the Black Death, but the total number of dead in Europe is probably around 55 to 65 million dead in the space of 7 years. Now, I'll talk more about places that were affected later, but it was primarily Europe. To live through that, I just can't even imagine it. If you think living through the last few years of the COVID-19 pandemic were bad, as of recording this, just under 7 million people have died from COVID-19. But in a world population of 8 billion, that's less than 0.01%. So it's not even close to the scale that was seen back then. Prior to the Black Death, about 443 million human beings were alive. After, by around the year 1400, there were only 374 million people. This disease would sweep in and wipe out more than half your neighbors and family within a few weeks or a month. The devastation is unimaginable to anyone who hasn't lived through a similar event. Okay, now, the first thing I'm going to ruin for you is that when we're talking about the plague, a disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the term Black Death refers to a time period wherein the disease entered Europe, not the disease itself. That time period is the years 1346 to 1353. The plague has been killing people for thousands of years, and it has had several large, major worldwide pandemics. but the Black Death refers only to this short time period, 1346 to 1353. So the year given at the beginning of the movie, 1348, it's accurate, but I have opinions about that, which I will share later. Secondly, the word germ mentioned in the opening, that didn't exist in 1348. It wasn't first used until about 200 years later, and at the time it then referred to a seed or a material that germinates and grows into a larger organism. It wasn't used to mean an invisible microbe like we use it today. Plague is fine. It's a word that was first used in the mid-1300s, so we'll give them that one. According to records and writings of the time, people living through the Black Death, though, they just called it the pestilence, the great mortality, the bumps disease, or simply the epidemic. The term Black Death itself wasn't coined until many centuries later. It came from a Latin expression, atra mors, where mors means death, and atra can mean terrible or black, but metaphorically, as in dark or ominous. Black is frequently mistaken for referring to the color of the sores or the gangrene that plague causes, but this is actually just a coincidence.
Word has reached the bishop of a village that does not suffer as the rest do.
So the movie opens with Eddie Redmayne playing Osmond, a young man who intends to take vows as a monk, and he's in isolation. There is another monk who has died and is being taken away and inspected, and you can see the burst sores on his armpits. So then we see Osmond checking his own armpits as a rat crawls ominously through the cell near him. But then Osmond asks if he can come out of quarantine because he says he has no signs of the disease. He is released, and then he immediately goes into the village to visit his secret girlfriend, and along the way you can see the scores of people who are dead and dying in the street. Now, at first glance, it appears that there are a few historically accurate things here. The monks and people carting bodies away are covering their faces with cloths and masks, but this is because back then the prevailing theory of disease spread was miasma. They thought the disease was spread through bad smells. So if you smelled something gross or if you smelled a dead body, then you could catch a disease or whatever it was that killed the person. This is where the name for malaria literally came from, mal-aria, meaning bad air. It was named because people way back when knew that if you went into the swamps, you were highly likely to catch malaria. But they thought it was because of the bad air or the bad smells of the nasty rotting swamp, not that it was due to insect bites of the mosquitoes that lived there. This is why in those classic plague doctor masks, the long noses were filled with things that smelled good, probably, fruits or fragrant herbs or flowers. Things that would block the bad smell because they thought it was literally blocking disease, not just making it easier to breathe. Plague doctors also wore a waxed gown and had a stick to whack sick people away to keep them away from them. And for a lot of things, these strategies might have worked, but I think it was probably met with mixed success for the plague, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. After Osmond sees his girlfriend, he sends her away back to Dunwich Forest, where the two of them came from. He says she'll be safer there and that he will come and meet her. Then Sean Bean shows up as the character Ulrich, who is a knight sent by the bishop to find out the source of the plague and to find out if the rumors of a village spared the pestilence are true. He is asking for help, a guide, and turns out that this village is supposedly right next to Dunwich Forest, so Osmond volunteers to guide them so he can go meet his girlfriend. They set out and meet up with a merry band of adventurers who have a huge cart full of lovely-looking torture devices, as apparently their real mission is to find and kill a supposed sorcerer who's been keeping this village free of plague. They set off traveling slowly by horse and foot, and as they travel, they come across a woman being tied to a stake in preparation for being burned as a witch, because the townspeople think she poisoned their well. This was mentioned in the opening monologue also, that people were afraid and some had decided that the plague was God's punishment, but others were convinced it was witchcraft or the devil's work. Talking about this too much will stray a little too far into the social history of the Black Death rather than the science of it, and I don't like to step outside my lane too much, but from what I've read, this people being accused of being witches was in vogue for a while. Over time, some stopped calling it witchcraft and they turned to the plague doctors and what I guess you could call the actual science of the day, such as it was, tonics and tinctures of herbs, that sort of thing. In the face of this completely unknowable disease, they turned to many different things for help and explanation as wave after wave of the pestilence hit them. So, speaking of the science, let's get to that.
A plague, more cruel and more pitiless than war, had descended upon us.
Just what exactly is the plague? There have been many different diseases that people call plague, but not all of them are the plague. This reminds me of that line from Once Upon a Time in Mexico where Danny Trejo says about El Mariachi, they call him El as in the. Well, this is the plague. There are a bunch of other short-lived plagues or diseases in history that we have absolutely no idea what caused them, but we know weren't caused by the plague bacterium, they were just called plague. Contemporary records or descriptions of the disease either weren't detailed enough for us to match the signs to diseases we know of today, or the symptoms described just don't match any diseases that we know of. There's the dancing plague of 1518, the sweating sickness of 1485 to 1551, the Great Dying in New England in the year 1616. There's even the issue that so many things look exactly the same and might be described so similar that we actually can't tell the difference. Just think, how many different things are there that give you a fever, aches and pains, or an upset tummy? How many different cold viruses are there? How many different flu viruses are out there, where some are mild and some are deadly? How do we know what caused the Black Death? Well, I'm glad you asked, so let me tell you. This is a bacterial disease caused by a little rod-shaped bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It's named for the scientist who researched and defined the disease in 1894, Alexander Yersin, and pestis, the Latin word for pestilence. Dr. Yersin was researching the plague in Hong Kong, presumably because the third historical plague pandemic began in the 1770s in China and had reached Hong Kong in 1894. There are good records of this identification from back then, and this is a bacterium that is still around and still causing infections and problems today, so we have been able to map out the disease course, how it infects people, and what symptoms it produces. We know now what we're looking for. But the farther back in time you go, the harder it is to really be sure of what someone died of. For plague victims, especially those who died during the Black Death, we are, quote, lucky in that there are good records, even from almost 700 years ago, of plague cemeteries where only those who died of the plague were buried. The cemetery containing the bodies of plague victims that were used in proving Yersinia pestis as the culprit was the East Smithfield Black Death Cemetery in London, and this work was done as part of a PhD thesis by anthropologist Dr. Sharon DeWitt at Pennsylvania State University. Since this is a bacterial disease that travels in the blood, what Dr. DeWitt did was extract the dental pulp and test it to see if there was any Yersinia pestis present. Now, if you're like me, the first thing you think of when you hear dental pulp is like the gunk from between your teeth, and you're wondering how that could have survived 700 years. Now, I don't fault you for thinking that, but dental pulp is actually the part under the enamel where all the nerves and blood vessels are. So the good thing about that is that it's very protected from decay, even across 7 centuries. You may not think it's a big deal or that it's been settled for ages what actually caused the Black Death, but this was only solved for certain in 2010 to 2011 when papers were finally published with the results of this dental pulp testing. Other theories were that it was anthrax or maybe an Ebola-like virus, and some people even thought smallpox. The plague and smallpox have actually been mixed up or sometimes hard to distinguish in records because smallpox causes bumps that ooze and used to kill a lot of people also. However, this is settled now because we do have this genetic testing. We do also have good contemporary descriptions of the plague during the Black Death. There's a lot of art and writings about it from the time because so many people were affected. And since the signs and symptoms match what we know happens to people still today who've died of or been infected with Yersinia, the scientists knew that this was likely the culprit. There are a couple different ways to catch the plague, and it presents differently in your body depending on how you catch it. The three main forms of plague are bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. Bubonic is the one you're thinking of, where you get swollen lymph nodes called buboes in your groin, your armpit, and often on your neck. This is by far the most common and is the type that swept Europe during the Black Death and causes most infections today. Bubonic plague is caught from a flea bite, or very rarely if you have a cut or an open wound and you come in contact with a person or an animal that died of plague. If enough bacteria get into the wound, then you can catch it that way. Side note, this is why I don't know if the plague doctor coats would be that protective, because a little flea can just jump up the coat and then jump onto your legs and nestle into your clothes that way. It might have been a little successful at stopping most fleas, but I bet not all of them. Non-flea transmission is also not restricted to just fresh corpses either, or to the fleas jumping off of them and onto you. There's one report of a wildlife biologist who became infected with plague after finding a weeks-old dead mountain lion, and Dr. Yersin himself said that plague bacteria can live in soil and that people can catch it that way if you come into contact with it. However you're infected, it takes about 3 to 5 days to develop the symptoms. There are some sources I saw that say 2 to 10 days, so it probably depends on the person and how many flea bites you got or how much bacteria you were given. In the Black Death time, people were described as developing boils at the site of flea bites, but this doesn't happen in modern plague that we've observed. Other general signs of infection include chills, a sudden onset of fever, sore muscles and joints, pains in your limbs and in your abdomen. And then your lymph nodes, commonly in your armpits or your groin, depending on if you were bitten on your arm or your leg. And then often on the neck also, they become swollen and can reach about the size of an egg, so about 10 centimeters across. These are called the buboes. They are very tender, like excruciatingly sore, and they will then often turn black due to blood coagulation, and then they will tear open and ooze pus and fluid. After about 3 to 5 days of this, 60% of people will die if they're untreated. Septicemic plague is the least common, likely caught in the same ways as bubonic, but it's where the bacteria are reproducing to high numbers in your blood rather than in your lymph nodes. In septicemic, the bacteria can cause an immune reaction that coagulates your blood in your extremities, which means fresh blood can't get to places like your fingers, your toes, your nose, or your ears, so you get gangrene and then you will die within about a week. Pneumonic plague occurs in one of two ways. So your blood will carry the bacteria to your lungs, either from the flea bite directly, or maybe because it's secondary to bubonic or septicemic, just from having such high numbers of bacteria in your blood. The bacteria arrive at your lungs, where they will gather and cause clotting and massive tissue death. And then you start coughing, you get flu-like symptoms, shortness of breath, again with the sudden onset of fever, and then you cough up a lot of blood and then you die, usually in 2 to 4 days. Septicemic and pneumonic are almost certainly deadly, but if you get treated within 18 to 24 hours of infection, it can take the mortality of pneumonic plague down to only about 25 to 50%. Pneumonic plague is also the only kind that is transmissible from human to human, which happens when there's so much bacteria in your lungs that you're hemorrhaging and coughing, and you just spray some of the bacteria out of the air and another person breathes it in. Anyways, as I just mentioned, bubonic plague is caused by a flea bite. Most often the rat flea, Xenophila chiopus, that lives on the common black rat, but currently we know that over 80 species of flea and 280 different mammals can carry the plague itself, from hamsters, gerbils, prairie dogs, and voles to cats and camels, foxes, coyotes, goats, and there's even one species of bird that has been noted to carry plague. Bubonic plague during the Black Death, though, this was caused by rats and rat fleas, and we can say we know this due to the unique way that the disease spreads. Now, before I talk about the spread during the Black Death period, I'll just briefly mention the other two major plague pandemics. The first recorded major plague pandemic was the Justinian plague, which began in the year 541 in Egypt and then spread to Constantinople and the rest of the Mediterranean basin within a few years. And then it kept hitting the area every couple of years in about 18 to 20 different outbreaks of disease until the year 750 CE, so over 200 years. It was named after the Roman Emperor of the Orient, aka the Byzantine Empire, at the time it hit, which was Justinian I. And I think naming it after him is a bit unfair. It's not like the poor guy was living at a time where there existed a cure or even the science to understand and prevent the plague, but he did nothing and refused to even try and keep his citizens safe. No, he was just the major world ruler when it began, and by the time it ended, tens of millions of people were dead, which is perhaps a third of the Mediterranean's population at the time. Skipping over the Black Death period for a moment, the third plague pandemic began in 1772 and ran until basically the end of World War II in 1945, which is coincidentally when antibiotics became widely available. The third pandemic began in southwestern China, and by 1900 the plague had invaded all continents except, I assume, the Antarctic. So it hit India in 1896, and Japan in 1899, Saudi Arabia and Turkey in 1897, and basically everywhere else by 1900, like I said, including the Americas. Canada, notably, has never had a detectable case of the plague, and so that's yet another reason why I love living here. We also have free healthcare that would take care of you if you did catch it. Before antibiotics, 2/3 of people who caught the plague would die, and then after antibiotics became accessible, that dropped to only about 5 to 10%, except for pneumonic, as I mentioned. So since the year 2000, over 26,000 cases of plague have been detected worldwide, including in the Americas, except Canada, and Asia, but with 97% of plague cases being in Africa. During this third pandemic, and by studying current outbreaks of the plague in Africa, it's been found that outbreaks are very much linked to climate. In several African countries, they found that plague outbreaks are much less likely when the temperature is below 15 or above 27 degrees C. Sorry, Americans, I don't know what that is in freedom units, but it means that this is basically very good evidence that this was primarily spread by insects. Insects, and particularly the rat flea, don't tend to survive cold winters and don't spread disease as much. It's also related to rainfall and humidity. In Vietnam, outbreaks were more common during the hot and dry times when those periods followed recent heavy rainfalls. This is because fleas require warmth and humidity to breed. But too moist or too warm, and not only can the flea larvae and pupae physically not go through metamorphosis properly, the soil will grow fungi and molds that will destroy the flea eggs. Rainfall also affects rodent burrows because if there's too much rain, the rodent burrows get flooded and that reduces their numbers. Floods and cold weather also reduce the availability of food. So there's a lot of factors here. I am simplifying it for my own sake as much as yours, but all of these factors are important in learning how this disease spread. So, when a rat carrying plague-infested fleas gets into a new uninfected colony, it will take about 2 weeks to spread and kill all of the rats. Then, it takes about 3 days for the fleas who feed on blood to begin starving. Now, at this point, they're going to turn to the closest animal. And because the black rat, which is the main carrier, likes to live near humans, whereas the gray or brown rats don't, humans are an easy next target for the fleas. After that, it takes, like I said, 3 to 5 days to develop an infection and 3 to 5 more days to die of bubonic plague. So, when plague moves into a new area, the first human death will occur about 3 to 4 weeks later. In smaller communities, it will be easier to notice a problem. Historians have found that in towns of a few thousand, it took about 40 days for there to be some realization of the scale of what was going on during the Black Death. And in cities of 10,000 to 100,000, it could be 7 or 8 weeks before there were enough plague deaths amongst all the other background health issues of living in a city before people started sounding the alarm. Now, bring all of this to the start of the Black Death period in 1346. Somewhere on the northwestern shores of the Caspian Sea, the bacteria began to spread. Maybe some rats got into a burrow with plague-infested soil, or maybe some people stumbled on or through a rat warren and picked up some of the fleas. The area at the time was ruled by the Mongol horde, and the horde had been laying siege to the port of Kaffa for a couple years. Kaffa is now called Feodosia, and it's in Ukraine. Somehow the horde became besieged themselves, but by the plague, probably through reinforcements or supply deliveries or something like that. To describe this, I want to read some of a nearly contemporary account because it's so descriptive and paints such a vivid picture. This was written by Gabriele de Musi, who was a notary in the Italian town of Piacenza. It's not thought that de Musi actually witnessed what happened at Kaffa, but this account was written probably in 1348 or 1349, so very shortly after, and it's said to be based on eyewitnesses, so it's presumed to be reliable. I have abridged it just a little bit, but the link to the full quote is in the sources. It begins. In 1346, in the countries of the East, countless numbers of Tartars and Saracens were struck down by a mysterious illness which brought sudden death. Within these countries, broad regions, far-spreading provinces, magnificent kingdoms, cities, towns, and settlements, ground down by illness and devoured by dreadful death, were soon stripped of their inhabitants. O God, see how the heathen Tartar races, pouring together from all sides, suddenly invested the city of Kaffa and besieged the trapped Christians there for almost 3 years. Behold, the whole army was affected by a disease which overran the Tartars and killed thousands upon thousands every day. It was as though arrows were raining down from heaven to strike and crush the Tartars' arrogance. All medical advice and attention was useless. The Tartars died as soon as the signs of disease appeared on their bodies. Swellings in the armpit or groin, caused by coagulating humors, followed by a putrid fever. The dying Tartars, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster brought about by the disease, and realizing that they had no hope of escape, lost interest in the siege. But they ordered corpses to be placed on catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. What seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them, although they dumped as many of the bodies as they could into the sea. And soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply, and the stench was so overwhelming that hardly 1 in several thousand was in a position to flee the remains of the Tartar army. Moreover, 1 infected man could carry the poison to others and infect people and places with the disease by look alone. No one knew or could discover a means of defense. So what this is describing is what is known as the first recorded incidents of biological warfare. Cadavers would definitely have spread disease, though from their fleas and blood, not from the stench. From this siege, people fleeing would have gotten into ships and taken the disease from Kaffa to Constantinople, and from there to Greece, Crete, Cyprus, Sicily, and Sardinia, all within 1346. In the show notes, there will be a link to my sources and transcript as always, and this time I will post a map of the spread by year also. So by 1348, there are records of plague outbreaks just in the southern part of England, though. All of this spread went really slowly, month by month creeping across Europe by port cities and then spreading inland. The plague arrived in England on or around May 8th of 1348 via a ship from Bordeaux that landed at Melcombe Regis in Dorset. The epidemic broke out on June 24th and spread inland slowly from there. It reached London in August, and there were people writing about it in September. So at this time, about 90% of people in Europe, all over Europe, were living in small towns and on farms in the countryside. They lived often as tenant farmers and paid rents out of what they earned from their crops. It was a very low population density, but the unique thing about the plague is that it killed more people in the countryside than it did in the cities. We can look at the death records and see this. It's true across Europe that the lower the population density, the higher the mortality. Now, this is different from pretty much every other disease out there, which kills more people when there's more people around. This is also how we can be sure that the main way plague spread was through bubonic and not pneumonic plague. Pneumonic would spread faster and easier with more people being around, but not only that, it burns itself out too quickly because it kills so fast. Fast-killing diseases don't tend to spread super far in general. So how did this happen then? Mr. Ula Benedicto proposes that this is a unique feature of rats and rat fleas spreading disease and the behavior of the fleas. I've already described how the rats will take about 2 to 3 weeks to die, and then 3 days later the fleas are starving, and where are they going to turn? To humans. For a rat colony of a given size with a certain number of fleas, when there are more people around to feed on, that's fewer fleas per person, and so fewer bites, and a lower bacterial load. On farms where perhaps only one family lives, maybe 4 to 5 people, that's a lot more fleas per person, lots of bites, and they're almost guaranteed to get a very high dose of infectious bacteria, which kills them. This is how we know that it's spread by rats and rat fleas, and how it killed so many people. That, to me, that's super fascinating. It makes so much more sense as to why people died more in the countryside than in the cities. And of course, Benedicto backs this up with data for Europe. The plague did also spread to North Africa and around the edges of the Mediterranean a bit, and while the Black Death period lasted only until 1353, the second pandemic was ongoing for many years. It hit in 1363, in 1374, in 83, all the way through to 1670. Almost without skipping a year, there were continuing outbreaks. However, a few places in Europe did escape. Iceland was spared the Black Death, but it was hit in the early 1400s. And Greenland and Finland were also said to be spared the Black Death. So notice how it's the colder and more northern countries? In the plague history of Norway, from the Black Death in 1348 through to the end of 1654, there was never an outbreak of plague in the winter. Plague cannot survive in the cold, which again reinforces that it's an insect vector-borne disease, because, like I said, they can't breed when it's too cold and they can't survive when it's too hot. So this brings me back to the beginning. The movie says it's 1348, and Osmond says at one point he's from the monastery at Staveley. Staveley is in the north of England, folks. It's way out past Blackpool. It's practically Scotland. From the plague maps that I've seen, this area wasn't infected with plague in 1348. Certainly not in the summer of 1348, as the plague was barely in England then. So I think a better year for this would have been 1349.
We journey into hell, but God travels with us.
Now, as I've mentioned, the plague killed around 60 to 65% of people, but not everyone who became infected with the plague would die. There is a genetic condition called familial Mediterranean fever, or FMF, that does appear to confer some resistance to the plague, and I presume to some other types of infections too. What FMF involves is mutations in the gene for pyrin, an immune protein that regulates fever, which is where the word pyrin comes from. It's the Greek word for fever. Pyrin turns on your immune system and is critical in how your body can mount an immune response. Mutations in the genes that control pyrin, or in the pyrin gene itself, result in it always being on or always being produced in your body to some level, not just when you're sick. In a normal body at rest, you don't want your immune system to always be on like that, so having FMF means that you have an always active immune response. This results in abdominal pains, joint pain, arthritis, and cycling fevers that can last anywhere from 12 hours to 3 days. It's not a very nice thing to have. However, when plague bacteria infect a person, they secrete molecules that downregulate your immune system. And in an average person, this means that they just can't mount an effective immune response, and so the bacteria take over and they die very quickly. In a person with an immune activator gene that is always on, it means they can fight off the bacteria much easier because their immune system is not being suppressed by the bacteria, and they will die from the plague at a lower rate. How this played out in the Black Death was not very much fun. Obviously, no one knew why certain groups of people with this mutation weren't dying. They didn't even know about the mutation. They just knew that some groups were not dying at the same rates as everyone else. And these groups were then persecuted quite heavily. What groups of people was it, you ask? Familial Mediterranean fever is seen mostly in people of Arab, Armenian, Jewish, or Turkish ancestry. I can't really take the time to get into this too much because, again, it's more social and history, which are not really my areas of study. But I will link a paper on this, which is unfortunately not open source, but if you have credentials, you can read it. Or there are books and websites you can look up and read about this more if you want to. To sum up, there was a lot of persecution against people from these cultural groups, as well as the Catalans from Spain, mendicants or beggars just in general, foreigners and travelers of any kind, and of course women. All of these groups were blamed, tortured, and killed for being the source of the plague. There is another gene that's had some mention of being helpful in resisting plague, and that is the gene for the cell surface receptor CCR5. You might recognize this as being the gene that can contain a deletion of part of its protein structure called the delta 32 deletion. And when this gene has that delta 32 deletion, it leads to resistance to HIV. From the bit of research I did, this resistance to plague is ambiguous with this gene mutation. It probably doesn't really have an effect on live animals, just in cell culture in a petri dish. Some scientists did breed mice without this CCR5 receptor entirely, and they didn't show a difference from the wild-type mice in how infected their cells became with Yersinia pestis. So I don't really think that this is, a thing. All right, now let's talk about treatments for the plague. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the treatment that they had was antiserum, which is antibodies purified from the blood of a person who has survived the plague. Before that, they didn't really have anything to treat it with. The antiserum would reduce mortality to between 10 to 30%, but it's only a short-term thing, and you can have severe allergic reaction side effects if other blood proteins aren't purified well enough, and you get them from someone with an incompatible blood type from yourself. The good news is that there is very little recorded antibiotic resistance in plague. So currently, you can use any antibiotic that you would use to treat something like E. coli. Today, mainly that's streptomycin or gentamicin, or a combination of doxycycline, ciprofloxacin, and chloramphenicol. Doctors tend to treat this very aggressively with multiple antibiotics at the same time because it is so deadly and you have such a short window to treat people with. In the movie, there's an incident where a healer makes a poultice for someone who's been stabbed. And this isn't related to the plague, but as I was watching, it made me go down a huge rabbit hole trying to figure out what this might have been. It looked to me like a moss of some kind, but when it was applied, it immediately stopped the pain of the stab wound. Now, I don't think there are any mosses that produce painkillers, at least none that I could find, but there are several other plants that do. Of course, we know about willow bark, where you get aspirin, but this mixture didn't look like bark to me. It was definitely leafy and green, which leads me maybe to something from the Lamiaceae family. Lamiaceae are commonly herbs, and they include things like rosemary, marubium, which is a flowering shrub with some antimicrobial activity, ironwort, also known as Greek mountain tea, and of course peppermint and other mints. All of these, plus many more members of the same family, have been shown to have some mild analgesic effects. One or more of these could have been in there, even though it really did look like moss and not rosemary or peppermint. But, I guess moss looks cooler and more swamp witchy. Now, finally, lastly, I want to talk about the few depictions of the bubonic plague in the movie. There are a few characters who catch it on this journey to hunt for the supposed sorcerer. I don't think this movie has been seen by enough people that I can safely assume most people know the ending, and since I hate giving spoilers, I won't say who it is, but a couple characters do display buboes on their bodies. One of them suddenly starts coughing and then reveals he has a large bubo on his neck. And then at the end, another character reveals that he has multiple buboes in both armpits. They've burst, they're oozing pus and blood everywhere. These buboes were a surprise in both cases, as no one was showing any symptoms at all, and from what I know now, this isn't correct. As I described the symptoms, patients would be very sore, they would have abdominal pain, sudden onset of fevers, and the buboes would be excruciatingly painful, probably to just wear your clothes over. It wouldn't just be, surprise, I'm sick. They would likely drop and be unable to move on initially and then develop buboes over the next day or so. It does make for a pretty sweet ending though. Except for the part where I said that bubonic plague is not spreadable from human to human, but I guess the guys would have been carrying the fleas too. Now, if you're wondering whether or not Sean Bean lives, well, like I said, I don't like spoilers, so you'll just have to go watch it yourself. I think it's worth it, but this movie is definitely not for kids, so please do not traumatize your children with it. Alright folks, that's all I have for this episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. I am a researcher, not a doctor, so please don't take any of this as medical advice. It is for entertainment only. You can follow me on Twitter at Biology Selfies, Facebook at Tierah Ruins Things with Science, and TikTok at Tierah Ruins Things. I'll put those names in the show notes, as well as a link where you can see all my sources and a transcript. I did all the research, writing, and recording. The music was written and provided by James Stratton Crawley, and there's a link to his channels in the show notes. And he also helped me with some of the editing. If you have suggestions for TV shows or movies featuring diseases or pathogens that you'd like me to cover, send them in to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com. See you all next time, where I will be talking about the Tomorrow War, which has some questionable understanding of how toxins and antitoxins work.